Okay, read the second half of this chapter. Oh, my goodness. Okay. Let me just get a little comfy. Okay. Page 292, workers and wage slaves. One ugly outgrowth of the factory system was an increasingly acute labor problem. Hitherto, manufacturing had been done in the home or in the small shop where the master craftsman and his apprentice, rubbing elbows at the same bench, could maintain an intimate and friendly relationship. The Industrial Revolution submerged this personal association in the impersonal ownership of stuffy factories and spindle cities. Around these, like tumors, the slum-like hovels of the wage slaves tended to cluster. Clearly, the early factory system did not shower its benefits evenly on all. While many owners grew plump, working people often wasted away at their workbenches. Hours were long, wages were low, and meals were skimpy and hastily gulped. Workers were forced to toil in unsanitary buildings that were poorly ventilated, lighted, and heated. They were forbidden by law to form labor unions to raise wages, for such cooperative activity was regarded as a criminal conspiracy. Not surprisingly, only 24 recorded strikes occurred before 1835. Especially vulnerable to exploitation were child workers. In 1820, a significant portion of the nation's industrial toilers were children under 10 years of age. Victims of factory labor, many children were mentally blighted, emotionally starved, physically stunted, and even brutally whipped in special whipping rooms. In Samuel Slater's mill of 1791, the first machine tenders were 7 boys and 2 girls, all under 12 years of age. By contrast, the lot of most adult wage workers improved markedly in the 1820s and 1830s. In the full flush of Jacksonian democracy, many of the states granted the laboring man the vote. Brandishing the ballot, he first strove to lighten his burden through working man's parties. Eventually, many workers gave their loyalty to the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson, whose attack on the Bank of the United States and against all forms of privilege reflected their anxieties about the emerging capitalist economy. In addition to such goals as the 10-hour day, higher wages, and intolerable working conditions, they demanded public education for their children and an end to the inhuman practice of imprisonment for debt. Employers, abhorring the rise of the rabble in politics, fought the 10-hour day to the last ditch. They argued that reduced hours would lessen production, increase costs, and demoralize the workers. Laborers would have so much leisure time that the devil would lead them into mischief. A red letter gain was at a length registered for labor in 1840 when President Van Buren established the 10-hour day for federal employees on public works. In ensuing years, a number of states gradually fell into line by reducing the hours of working people. Day laborers at last learned that their strongest weapon was to lay down their tools, even at the risk of prosecution under the law. Dozens of strikes erupted in 1830s and 1840s, most of them for higher wages, some for the 10-hour day, and few for such unusual goals as the right to smoke on the job. The workers usually lost more strikes than they won, for the employer could resort to such tactics as the importing of strike breakers, often derisively called scabs or rats, and often fresh off the boat from the old world. Labor long raised its voice against the unrestricted unpouring of wage-depressing and union-busting immigrant workers. Labor's early and painful efforts at organization had netted some 300,000 trade unionists by 1830, but such encouraging gains were dashed on the rocks of hard times following the severe depression of 1837. As unemployment spread, union membership shriveled, yet toilers won a promising legal victory in 1842. The Supreme Court of Massachusetts ruled in the case of Commonwealth v. Hunt that labor unions were not illegal conspiracies, provided that their methods were honorable and peaceful. This enlightened decision did not legalize the strike overnight throughout the country, but it was a significant signpost of the times. Trade unions still had a rocky road to hoe, stretching ahead for about a century before they could meet management on relatively even terms. Women and the economy. Women and the economy. Women were also sucked into the clanging mechanism of factory production. Farm women and girls had an important place in the pre-industrial economy, spinning yarn, weaving cloth, and making candles, soap, butter, and cheese. New factories such as the textile mills of New England undermined these activities, cranking out manufactured goods much faster than they could be made by hand at home. Yet these same factories offered employment to the very young women whose work they were displacing. Factory jobs promised greater economic independence for women, as well as the means to buy manufactured products of the new market economy. Factory girls typically toiled 6 days a week, earning a pittance for a dreary, limb-numbing, ear-splitting stints of 12 or 13 hours, from dark to dark. The Boston Associates nonetheless proudly pointed to their textile mill at Lowell, Massachusetts as a showplace factory. The workers were virtually all New England farm girls, carefully supervised on and off the job by watchful matrons. Escorted regularly to church from their company boarding houses and forbidden to form unions, they had few opportunities to share dissatisfactions over the grueling working conditions. But factory jobs of any kind were still unusual for women. Opportunities for women to be economically self-supporting were scarce and consisted mainly of nursing, domestic service, and especially teaching. The dedicated Catherine Beecher, unmarried daughter of a famous preacher and sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, tirelessly urged women to enter the teaching profession. She eventually succeeded beyond her dreams, as men left teaching for other lines of work and school teaching became a thoroughly feminized occupation. Other work opportunities for women beckoned in household service. Perhaps one white family in 10 employed servants at mid-century, most of whom were poor white, immigrant, or black women. About 10% of white women were working for pay outside their own homes in 1850. And estimates that are about 20% of all women had been employed at some time prior to marriage. The vast majority of working women were single. Upon marriage, they left their paying jobs and took up their new work, without wages, as wives and mothers. In the home that they were enshrined in a cult of domesticity, a widespread cultural creed that glorified the customary functions of the homemaker. From their pedestal, married women commanded immense moral power, and they increasingly made decisions that altered the character of the family itself. Women's changing roles and spreading industrial revolution brought some important changes in the life of the 19th century home. The traditional women's sphere. Love, not parental arrangement, more and more frequently determined the choice of a spouse, yet parents often retained the power of veto. Families thus became more closely knit and affectionate, providing the emotional refuge that made the threatening impersonality of big city industrialism tolerable to many people. Most striking families grew smaller. The average household had nearly 6 members at the end of the 18th century, but fewer than 5 members a century later. The fertility rate, or number of births among women ages 14 to 45, dropped sharply among white women in the years after the Revolution, and, in the course of the 19th century as a whole, fell by half. Birth control was still a taboo topic for polite conversation, and contraceptive technology was primitive, but clearly some form of family limitation was being practiced quietly and effectively in countless families, rural and urban alike. Women undoubtedly played a large part, perhaps the leading part, in decisions to have fewer children. This newly assertive role for women has been called domestic feminism, because it signified the growing power and independence of women, even while they remained wrapped in the cult of domesticity. Smaller families, in turn, meant child-centered families, because where children are fewer, parents can lavish more care on them individually. European visitors to the United States in the 19th century often complained about the unruly behavior of American brats. But though American parents may have increasingly spared the rod, they did not spoil their children. Lessons were enforced by punishments other than the hickory stick. When the daughter of the novelist Harriet Beecher Stowe neglected to do her homework, her mother sent her from the dinner table and gave her only bread and water in her own apartment. What Europeans saw as permissiveness was in reality the consequence of an emerging new idea of child-rearing, in which the child's will was not to be simply broken, but rather shaped. In the little republic of the family, as in the republic at large, good citizens were raised not to be meekly obedient to authority, but to be independent individuals who could make their own decisions on the basis of internalized moral standards. Thus, the outlines of the modern family were clear by the mid-century. It was small, affectionate, and child-centered, and it provided a special arena for the talents of women. Feminists of a later day might decry the stifling atmosphere of the 19th century middle-class white home, but to many women of the time, it seemed a big step upward from the conditions of the grinding toil, often alongside men in the fields, in which their mothers had lived. Western farmers reap a revolution in the fields. As smoke-belching factories altered the eastern skyline, flourishing farms were changing the face of the West. The Trans-Allegheny region, especially the Ohio, Indiana, Illinois tier, was fast becoming the nation's breadbasket. Before long, it would become a granary to the world. Pioneer families first hacked a clearing out of the forest and then planted their painfully furrowed fields to corn. The yellow grain was amazingly versatile. It could be fed to hogs, corn on the hoof, or distilled into liquor, corn in the bottle. Both these products could be transported more easily than the bulky grain itself, and they became the early Western farmers' staple market items. So many hogs were butchered, traded, or shipped at Cincinnati that day that the city was known as the Porkopolis of the West. Most Western produce was at first floated down the Ohio-Mississippi River system to feed the lusty appetite of the booming cotton kingdom. But Western farmers were as hungry for profits as Southern slaves and planters were for food. These tillers, spurred on by the easy availability of seemingly boundless acres, sought ways to bring more and more land into cultivation. Ingenious inventors came to their aid. One of the first obstacles that frustrated the farmers was the thickly matted soil of the West, which snagged the snapped, fragile wooden plows. John Deere of Illinois in 1837 finally produced a steel plow that broke the stubborn soil. Sharp and effective, it was also light enough to be pulled by horses rather than oxen. In the 1830s, Virginia-born Cyrus McCormick contributed the most wondrous contraption of all, a mechanical mower reaper. The clattering cogs of McCormick's horse-drawn machine were to the western farmers what the cotton gin was to the southern planters. Seated on his red chariot reaper, a single husbandman could do the work of 5 men with sickles and scythes. No other American invention cut so wide a swath as the McCormick reaper. It made ambitious capitalists out of humble plowmen, who now scrambled for more acres on which to plant more fields of billowing wheat. Subsistence farming gave way to food production for both domestic and foreign markets, as large-scale, extensive, specialized cash crop agriculture came to dominate the trans-Allegheny West. With it followed the mounting indebtedness as farmers bought more land and more machinery to work it. Soon, hustling farmer business people were annually harvesting a larger crop than the South, which was becoming self-sufficient in food production, could devour. They began to dream of markets elsewhere, in the mushrooming factory towns of the East or across the faraway Atlantic. But they were still largely landlocked. Commerce moved north and south on the river systems. Before it could begin to move east-west in bulk, a transportation revolution would have to occur. Highways and steamboats. Whew! In 1789, when the Constitution was launched, primitive methods of travel were still in use. Waterborne commerce, whether along the coast or on the rivers, was slow, uncertain, and often dangerous. Stagecoaches and wagons lurched over bone-shaking roads. Passengers would be routed out to lay nearby fence rails across muddy stretches, and occasionally horses would drown in muddy pits while wagons sank slowly and out of sight. Cheap and efficient carriers were imperative if raw materials were to be transported to factories and if finished products were to be delivered to consumers. On December 3rd, 1803, a firm in Providence, Rhode Island, sent a shipment of yarn to a point 60 miles away, notifying the purchaser that the consignment could be expected to arrive in the course of the winter. A promising improvement came in the 1790s when a private company completed the Lancaster Turnpike in Pennsylvania. It was a broad, hard-surfaced highway that thrust 62 miles westward from Philadelphia to Lancaster. As drivers approached the toll gate, they were confronted with a barrier of sharp pikes, which were turned aside when they paid their toll. Hence the term turnpike. The Lancaster Turnpike proved to be a highly successful venture, returning as high as 15% annual dividends to its stockholders. It attracted a rich trade to Philadelphia and touched off a turnpike building boom that lasted about 20 years. It also stimulated Western development. The turnpikes beckoned to the canvas-covered Conestoga wagons, whose creakings heralded a westward advance that would know no real retreat. Western road building, always expensive, encountered many obstacles. One pesky roadblock was the noisy states' riders who opposed federal aid to local projects. Eastern states also protested against being bled of their populations by the westward-reaching arteries. Westerners scored a notable triumph in 1811 when the federal government started construction of the National Road, also known as the Cumberland Road, in honor of its starting point in Cumberland, Maryland. Although the construction was interrupted by the War of 1812 and by states' riders' complaints about federal grants for internal improvements, the road reached Vandalia, Illinois, 591 miles to the west in 1839. Later extensions brought it from Baltimore on Chesapeake Bay to the banks of the Mississippi River in St. Louis. The steamboat craze, which overlapped the turnpike craze, was touched off by an ambitious painter-engineer named Robert Fulton. He installed a powerful steam engine in a vessel that posterity came to know as the Clermont, but that a dubious public dubbed Fulton's Folly. On a historic day in 1807, the quaint little ship, belching sparks from its single smokestack, churned steadily from New York City up the Hudson River toward Albany. It made the run of 150 miles in 32 hours. The success of the steamboat was sensational. People could now, in a large degree, defy wind, wave, tide, and downstream current. Within a few years, Fulton had changed all of America's navigable systems into two-way arteries, thereby doubling their carrying capacity. Hitherto, Neil boats had been pushed up the Mississippi with quivering poles and raucous profanity at less than 1 mile an hour, a process that was prohibitively expensive. Now the steamboats could churn rapidly against the current, ultimately attaining speeds in excess of 10 miles an hour. The mighty Mississippi had met its master. By 1820, there were some 60 steamboats on the Mississippi and its tributaries. By 1860, about 1,000, some of them luxurious river palaces. Keen rivalry among the swift and gaudy steamers led to memorable races. Excited passengers would urge the captain to pile on wood at the risk of bursting the boilers, which all too often exploded, with the tragic results for the floating fire traps. When the steamer Sultana blew up in April 1865, the explosion killed 1,700 passengers, including many Union prisoners of war being repatriated to the north. Trucking steamboats played a vital role in the opening of the West and South, both of which were richly endowed with navigable rivers. Like bunches of grapes on a vine, population clustered along the banks of the broad flowing streams. Cotton growers and other farmers made haste to take up turn over the now profitable soil. Not only could they float their produce out to market, but hardly less important, they could ship at low cost their shoes, hardware, and other manufactured necessities. Clinton's Big Ditch in New York. A canal-cutting craze paralleled the boom in turnpikes and steamboats. A few canals had been built around falls and elsewhere in colonial days, but ambitious projects lay in the future. Resourceful New Yorkers, cut off from federal aid by states' riders, themselves dug the Erie Canal, linking the Great Lakes with the Hudson River. They were blessed with the driving leadership of Governor DeWitt Clinton, whose grandiose project was scoffingly called Clinton's Big Ditch, or the Governor's Gutter. Begun in 1817, the canal eventually ribboned 363 miles. On its completion in 1825, a garlanded canal boat glided from Buffalo on Lake Erie to the Hudson River and on to New York Harbor. There, with colorful ceremony, Governor Clinton emptied a cask of water from the lake to symbolize the marriage of the waters. The water from Clinton's keg baptized the Empire State. Mule-drawn passengers and bulky freight could now be handled with thrift and dispatch at the dizzy speed of 5 miles an hour. The cost of shipping a ton of grain from Buffalo to New York City fell from $100 to $5, and the time of transit from about 20 days to 6. Ever-widening economic ripples followed the completion of the Erie Canal. The value of land along the route skyrocketed, and new cities, such as the Rochester and Syracuse, blossomed. Industry in the state bloomed. New profitability of farming in the Old Northwest, notably in Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois, attracted thousands of European immigrants to the unaxed and untaxed lands now available. Flotillas of steamships soon piled the Great Lakes, connecting with the canal barges at Buffalo. Interior waterside villages like Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago exploded into mighty cities. Other profound economic and political changes followed the canal's completion. The price of potatoes in New York City was cut in half, and many dispirited New England farmers, no longer able to face the ruinous competition, abandoned their rocky holdings and went elsewhere. Some became mill hands, thus speeding the industrialization of America. Others, finding it easy to go west of the Erie Canal, took up new farmland south of the Great Lakes, where they were joined by thousands of New Yorkers and other Northerners. Still others shifted to fruit, vegetable, and dairy farming. The transformations in the Northeast Canal consequences showed how long-established local market structures could be swamped by the emerging behemoth of continental economy. And as American products began to flow into international markets, even far-off Europeans began to feel the effects of America's economic vitality. Before long, Italian and Polish peasants, displaced from their marginal farms by the arrival of cheap American grains, would come to America to build new lives. The Iron Horse. The most significant contribution to the development of such an economy proved to be the railroad. It was fast, reliable, cheaper than canals to construct, and not frozen over in winter. Able to go almost anywhere, even through the Allegheny Barrier, it defied terrain and weather. The first railroad appeared in the United States in 1828, and new lines spread with amazing swiftness. Andrew Jackson rode to his first presidential inauguration in 1829 in a horse-drawn carriage. At the end of his second term, 8 years later, he departed from Washington in a railway car. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, the United States boasted 30,000 miles of railroad track, 3/4 of it in the rapidly industrializing North. At first, the railroad faced strong opposition from vested interests, especially canal backers. Anxious to protect its investment in the Erie Canal, the New York legislature in 1833 prohibited the railroads from carrying freight, at least temporarily. Early railroads were also considered a dangerous public menace, for flying sparks could set fire to nearby haystacks and houses, and appalling railway accidents could turn the wooden miniature hells into flaming funeral pyres for their riders. Railroad pioneers had to overcome other obstacles as well. Brakes were so feeble that the engineer might miss the station twice, both arriving and backing up. Arrivals and departures were conjectural, and numerous differences in gauge, the distance between the rails, meant frequent changes of trains for passengers. In 1840, there were 7 transfers between Philadelphia and Charleston, but gauges gradually became standardized. Better brakes did break, safety devices were adopted, and the Pullman sleeping palace was introduced in 1859. America, at long last, was being bound together with braces of iron, later to be made of steel. Cables, clippers, and pony riders. Other forms of transportation and communication were binding together the United States and the world. A crucial development came in 1858 when Cyrus Field, called the greatest wire puller in history, organized a joint Anglo-American-Canadian venture to stretch a cable under the deep North Atlantic waters from Newfoundland to Ireland. Although this initial cable went dead after 3 weeks of public rejoicing, a heavier cable laid in 1866 permanently linked the American and European continents. The United States Merchant Marine encountered rough sailing during much of the early 19th century. American vessels had been repeatedly laid up by the embargo, the War of 1812, and the panics of 1819 and 1837. American naval designers made few contributions to maritime progress. A pioneer American steamer, the Savannah, crept across the Atlantic in 1819, but it used sail most of the time and was pursued for a day by a British captain who thought it a fire. Excuse me. In the 1840s and 1850s, a golden age dawned for American shipping. Yankee naval yards, notably Donald Mackay's at Boston, began to send down the ways sleek new craft called clipper ships. Long, narrow, and majestic, they glided across the sea under towering masts and clouds of canvas. In a fair breeze, they could outrun any steamer. The stately clippers sacrificed cargo space for speed, and their captains made killings by hauling high-value cargoes in record times. They wasted much they wrested much of the tea-carrying trade between the Far East and Britain from their slower-sailing British competitors, and they sped thousands of impatient adventurers to the goldfields of California and Australia. But the hour of glory for the clipper was relatively brief. On the eve of the Civil War, the British had clearly won the world race for maritime ascendancy with their iron tramp steamers, tea kettles. Although slower and less romantic than the clipper, these vessels were steadier, roomier, and more reliable, and hence more profitable. No story of rapid American communication would be complete without inducing the Far West. By 1858, horse-drawn overland stagecoaches, immortalized by Mark Twain's Roughing It, were a familiar sight. Their dusty tracks stretched from the banks of the muddy Missouri River clear to California. Even more dramatic was the Pony Express, established in 1860 to carry mail speedily the 2,000 lonely miles from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. Daring, lightweight riders, leaping onto wiry ponies saddled at stations approximately 10 miles apart, could make the trip in an amazing 10 days. These unarmed horsemen galloped on, summer or winter, day or night, through dust or snow, past Indians and bandits. The speeding postmen missed only one trip, though the whole enterprise lost money heavily and folded after only 18 legend-leaving months. Just as the clippers had succumbed to steam, so were the express riders unhorsed by Samuel Morse's clacking keys, which began tapping messages to California in 1861. The swift ships and fleet ponies ushered out a dying technology of wind and muscle. In the future, machines would be in the saddle. Excuse me. Sorry, there was something stuck in my throat. Okay. The transport web binds the Union. More than anything else, the desire of the East to tap the West stimulated the transportation revolution. Until about 1830, the produce of the western region drained southward to the cotton belt or the heaped-up wharves of New Orleans. The steamboat vastly aided the reverse flow of the finished goods up the watery western arteries and helped bind West and South together. But the truly revolutionary changes in commerce and communication came in the 3 decades before the Civil War, as canals and railroad tracks radiated out from the east, across the Alleghenies and into the blossoming heartland. The ditch diggers and tie layers were attempting nothing less than a conquest of nature itself. They would offset the natural flow of the trade on the interior rivers by laying down an impressive grid of internal improvements. The builders succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The Mississippi was increasingly robbed of its traffic as goods moved eastward on chugging trains, puffing lake boats, and mule-tug canal barges. Governor Clinton had in effect picked up the mighty father of waters and flung it over the Alleghenies, forcing it to empty into the sea at New York City. By the 1840s, the city of Buffalo handled more western produce than the New Orleans. Between 1836 and 1860, grain shipments through Buffalo increased a staggering 60-fold. New York City became the seaboard queen of the nation, a gigantic port through which a vast hinterland poured its wealth and to which it daily paid economic tribute. By the eve of the Civil War, a truly continental economy had emerged. The principle of division of labor, which spelled productivity and profits in the factory, applied on a national scale as well. Each region now specialized in a particular type of economic activity. The South raised cotton for export to New England and Britain. The West grew grain and livestock to feed factory workers in the East and Europe. And the East made machines and textiles for the South and the West. The economic pattern thus woven had fateful political and military implications. Many Southerners regarded the Mississippi as a silver chain that naturally linked together the Upper Valley states and the Cotton Kingdom. They would become convinced, as secession approached in the 1850s, that some or all of these states would have to secede with them or to be strangled. But they would overlook the man-made links that increasingly bound the upper Mississippi Valley to the east in an intimate commercial union. Southern rebels would have to fight not only northern armies, but the tight bonds of an interdependent continental economy. Economically, the two northerly sections were conjoined twins. The market revolution. No less revolutionary than the political upheavals of the antebellum era was the market revolution that transformed a subsistence economy of scattered farms and tiny workshops into a national network of industry and commerce. Greater mechanization and a more robust market-oriented economy raised new legal questions about winners and losers. How tightly should patents protect inventions? Should the government regulate monopolies? Who should own the technologies and networks that made America hum in the 1840s and 1850s? Under Chief Justice John Marshall, the U.S. Supreme Court vigilantly protected contract rights by requiring state governments to grant irrevocable charters. Monopolies easily developed, as new companies found it difficult to break into markets. After Marshall died in 1835, the climate began to change, and the winds of economic opportunity blew more freely. When the proprietors of Boston Charles River Bridge, which included Harvard College, sued the owners of the New Bourne Bridge for unconstitutionally violating their original contract, the new Chief Justice, Roger B. Taney, sided with the newcomers and argued that the rights of the community outweighed any exclusive corporate rights. Taney's decision opened new entrepreneurial channels and encouraged greater competition. So did the passage of more liberal state and corporation laws beginning in the 1830s, granting investors the benefit of limited liability if their companies were sued or went bankrupt. As more and more Americans, mill workers as well as farm hands, women as well as men, linked their economic fate to the burgeoning market economy, the self-sufficient households of colonial days were transformed. Most families had once bartered with their neighbors for the few necessities they could not make themselves. In growing numbers, they now scattered to work for wages in the mills, or they planted just a few crops for sale at market and used the money to buy goods made by strangers in far-off factories. As store-bought fabric, candles, and soap replaced homemade products, a quiet revolution occurred in the household division of labor and status. Traditional women's work was rendered superfluous and devalued. The home itself, once a center of economic production in which all family members cooperated, grew into a place of refuge from the world of work, a refuge that became increasingly the special and separate sphere of women. Revolutionary advances in manufacturing and transportation brought increased prosperity to all Americans, but they also widened the gulf between the rich and the poor. Millionaires had been rare in the early days of the Republic, but by the eve of the Civil War, several specimens of colossal finance success were strutting across the national stage. Spectacular was the case of fur trader and real estate speculator John Jacob Astor, who left an estate of $30 million on his death in 1848. Cities bred the greatest extremes of economic inequality. Unskilled workers, then as always, fared worst. Many of them came to make up a floating mass of drifters buffeted from town to town by the shifting prospects for menial jobs. These wandering workers accounted at various times for up to half the population of the brawling industrial centers. Although their numbers were large, they left little behind them but the homely fruits of their transient labor. Largely unstoried and unsung, they are among the forgotten men and women of American history. Many myths about social mobility grew up over the buried memories of these unfortunate day laborers. Mobility did exist in industrializing America, but not in the proportions that legend often portrays. Rags to riches success stories were relatively few. Yet America, with its dynamic society and wide-open spaces, undoubtedly provided more opportunity than did the contemporary countries of the Old World, which is why millions of immigrants packed their bags and headed for New World shores. Moreover, a rising tide lifts all boats, and the improvement in overall standards of living was real. Wages for unskilled workers in a labor-hungry America rose about 1% a year from 1820 to 1860. This general prosperity helped diffuse the potential class conflict that might otherwise have exploded, and that did explode in many European countries. And that's chapter 14. I actually liked this one because I really liked the Industrial Revolution. Okay, yay!